Right, hello, everything seems to be set up and working. So today I'm going to take a look at we're going to take a look at sorting out an animated accessory. So we're probably not going to do the animation itself, but what we're going to look at is setting up the armature for or to accommodate an animated accessory. So this pet, air quotes, or pets in general for IMVU are essentially glorified accessories. And the way that you set up the skeleton or the armature for a pet is exactly the same as you would do it for any other type of animated accessory item. So if you were doing a set of earrings, a tail, anything, it's the same basic process. And what we do is, so this is the accessory. Let me just open up another instance of Blender. Whoops. So accessory items generally start with the accessory files, which are, where is it? Let's just use the male accessory. I think that's the one we actually used. Oh, the bug, AMD. So this is the accessory starter file. And basically, every bone of the avatar has its own independent armature. Each one represents a bone of the avatar. And what we do with our accessories is we set up, well, we use the armatures as the basis for our meshes. So if we were to give, I don't know, let's say a plate of armor on the thigh here, we might use this armature as the basis around which that mesh is built. But if the thigh plate animated, so let's say it opened, the section of this opened, we would still use the accessory, not the accessory, we'd still use the armature that's associated with that bone. But what we might do is add another bone to this armature, which acts as our anchor point. What we then do is parent the mesh to this bone, and it's this bone that we animate. We don't animate the armature itself or the root armature, the accessory armature. We animate the bone that we link with it, or that forms part of the overall armature. So what we're doing is adding another bone to the root armature, which itself has two bones. So it's a little confusing, but it'll make sense in a moment. But when you're making animated accessories, you don't animate the root armature. We link or create or add bones to this, and then we animate those. So your accessory items, animated or not, should always generally start with the accessory file. So there's the male version. Where's the female version gone? Oh, there it is. Oh. And the female version, they're exactly the same. same skeleton, but obviously the difference is that there are slight differences between the mesh positions relative to the skeleton. It's the same skeleton, same set of bones or armatures, but it's just that the positions for the meshes are slightly different. So let's close that. So for our pumpkin, what we're going to do is associate this with the root. So let's just hide this for the moment and unhide the skeletons. What we're going to do is associate that pumpkin with female O3 master root. So we've got the name there, we've got the name there, and we've got the name on the object as well. So keeping in mind what we've just been talking about, what we're going to do is add a bone to this armature that we're going to displace or offset, because this is at the feet of the avatar. So if we want meshes, so if we were to set everything up as it currently is, the pumpkin would appear at the avatar's feet, which we don't necessarily want. We want this to be offset to one side. So what we have to do is add a bone to our armature and then just offset it where we want it placed. So it can either be, well, it can be anywhere actually. Pets are normally sat to the side, but they literally can be anywhere. So anywhere, because the female O3 master root, that essentially is our anchor point. And when in IMVU, or when we import that into IMVU, that will latch onto female O3 master root, that bone of the armature. So what we're going to do, we've got wireframe, that's right, so disable that. Right, so first thing we need to do is just shift this to one side so that we've got our position marked out where we want it to be. Whoops. It's in several parts, so actually before we do that then we'll have to join them together. Actually, before... Right, so yes. So depending on how you've got your object set up. So this is in 3 parts just because it was easier to make that way. So there's the main body. There's a lower eyelid part, and then there's the eyeball. So what we want to do is the eyeball is going to rotate or animate separate to the main torso, but the bottom eyelid isn't, so we can join those two together. So select and shift click, and then object, where's it gone, join, and that just joins them together. So now we've just got 2 objects that we need to move. Shove those to one side. Yeah, that's all right. So select the armature, edit mode, and we've got two bones that we can select if it'll let us. This is where it gets a bit iffy. Yeah, so because the armature is in X-ray mode, well, it's viewport display, it's drawn in front. So that just makes it easier to see whilst we're actually working on the scene. So it's drawn in front. But the disadvantage of having that enabled is that when we're in edit mode, the bones are kind of tricky to select. So what can sometimes help is switching to wireframe, which is much easier to select the bones. So we can either select root, which is the one that's hidden at the moment, attachment root, or attachment node. Attachment root is the root bone of the armature. Attachment node, that used to have a purpose, but I don't think it does anymore. So click the armature until you get attachment root selected, and then armature, duplicate, and this will just duplicate the bone. It will create an instance, press escape just to reset, and then we're going to use the manipulation widget tools just to move that to where our eye is. So we need, because this is going to be animated, we need two bones. We need one to control the overall object, which will likely be just this bone, and then we need another one to control the eye, because we want the eye to move independently of the object itself. So with this bone still selected, we can just duplicate that. Escape, and then what we want to do is move that roughly into position where it needs to be. View, viewpoint, right. We can sort this out later, but the center point of the eye is about there. So this is the eye. So we want to make sure that this bone is positioned at the center, which we'll sort out in a second, because it then allows this bone to rotate the mesh based on its center point. So if you rotate if the eye is rotated, it'll rotate around that center rather than being offset or screwy, because the center is in the wrong place. So if we set it at the back here or at the front, it means that the eyeball is rotating relative to those centers rather than its actual center, which is what we need for something that's like something like this. But what we can do to get the position exact, exit edit mode, object mode, select our eyeball. Let's just hide the pumpkin for the moment, and the avatar meshes. So that's our eyeball, and we can see it has an origin. What we're going to do is snap this bone to that point. So what that should do is snap this, whoops, snap the head of the bone, which is this, to that point, and it'll shift the whole bone relative to that position as well. So that makes sure absolutely that the bone is where it should be. So select the eyeball, object, snap, and we want cursor to selected. So that's moved the 3D cursor, which is this red and white thing. And all we need to do is select the armature, go back into edit mode, select our bone, and hopefully this should snap that. So what we're going to do is armature, snap, selection to cursor. And it, oh, we were almost spot on. It did move it, but it was just fractionally. So that now means that that bone is positioned exactly where it needs to be to rotate that sphere around its center point. Exit edit mode. Let's just double check our positions. Whoops. Not quite sure what happened there. Okay, that's weird. Not at all sure why that's moving like that. Oh, that's why. Yeah, so this is something that you have to be aware of when making animated accessories. If you've been doing some animation, so this does have an animation associated with it, which is a blink, but it's a shape key animation. But in order for the shape key to work, you have to have an action. So we're in the action editor at the moment, but it does have a shape key. But the problem with that is that means that the object has a sequence associated with it. And that's recording the position of the object. So we can do one of two things. We can either just remove that and put that back into position, and we'll see that all of this has remained grey because there's no animation data associated with doing that. But if we didn't do that, we can see that this panel is coloured, it's tinted now, which indicates that there are animation sequence data associated with it. So if we moved it, we're actually creating animation data. So the simplest thing to do is just select our object and delete the action that's associated with it whilst we're doing this. Whilst we're doing this setup, we can sort that out later. Right, so that is our simple skeleton. So we've used female O3 master root, that's the attachment root, for our accessory item, and we've added 2 bones to it. What we're going to do is just name these. So back into edit mode, and we want bone properties. click in the input box, call this pumpkin. And this one we want eyeball. Want to check their relations. So that's their relationship to each other. So there are no parents. These bones are independent of the others in the group. So what we want to do is create a relationship between these bones, like so. So we're joining this one to this one to this one. So select Relations panel, and we're going to click on this parent. It'll give us a list of bones, and we want pumpkin, and what we should see is a dotted line appearing, and that indicates there's a relationship between the selected object and the thing that it's parented to. Oh, it's that way around. So there it is. So it's head to tail. Do the same thing for pumpkin. So that'll go from head to tail. We want attachment root. So we've now got, whoops, pose mode. We can check this. Pose mode, just press the R key. And because we have attachment root, which is the master root, we can't see it because it's hidden. So bones highlight blue. Soup. We're not doing that kind of object for IMVU. This is just a simple armature. That's all it is. So that just tests the armature to make sure it all moves. What we can now do is set up, that's the armature setup, so what we can now do is set up the mesh, so go back into object mode, so that it moves with our armature. So what we have to do for that is set up some vertex groups. So eyeball, object data properties, vertex groups. Click on the plus button, create our group, double click, call this eyeball, enter, and we need to apply that group to our eyeball. So that's applied it or associated it with that as an object, the eyeball as an object. What we now have to do is associate the group with the mesh itself, which is the vertices. So object, edit mode. So we need to select everything, select all, and then whilst we're in edit mode, we have a new set of buttons appear. So we click assign, and that's assigned that group to all the vertices of that object. So if we select, we can use deselect and select to check that, and it'll select the whole thing. We're going to repeat the process for the pumpkin. So select. We've already got some vertex groups which help with object selection whilst we're making the mesh, so these can be ignored. They're there just as a selection aid. So click the plus button, double click, pumpkin, edit mode, select all, make sure that's highlighted, then click the assign button again, double check, perfect, object. So what we're going to do now, let's just save this actually, so file, save as, 9. Now we need to associate these meshes, so we've got two, pumpkin, eyeball. We need to associate the pumpkin with the armature, and we could do that two ways. We can either physically parent the objects together, so that's we're selecting actual objects, so mesh, armature, and then we go into the object menu, parent, object, and then we'll get a pop-up appearing, or which confirms the connection, or we select the mesh, go into modifiers, and we add an armature modifier to the mesh. We then set the armature that we want as the object that it's linked to. So to get accessory items to work in IMVU, we need to use an armature modifier. So if you don't have an armature modifier on your accessory mesh, it won't work. I don't think it even appears in IMVU. So in order to get it to work, you need to have the armature modifier. So the purpose of adding a parent, so we're physically parenting the objects together, so that's a mesh as an object and the armature as an object. The reason for parenting them together is that the armature doesn't modify, well, it doesn't change or animate the mesh whilst we're working on the project. So if we add the armature, so let's just do this, use the eyedropper, select the armature, so we've got a connection now, so it's got our armature in place. So if we select the armature and we move it, so we wanted to move this somewhere else, for example, the mesh doesn't move with it. It only does it in pose mode, well, at least by default anyway. So if we select attachment root and move it, it moves the mesh with it. So to compensate for that, we do have some buttons or additional buttons. Yes, soup. If depending on how you want to set up the eyes for the pumpkin, the easiest thing to do is just make a cycling or scrolling texture, and you have different colors at different frames. Well, it depends how you want to do it actually, because you could do it in a way that, so if you had your texture, and let's say you had you could have 4 different colors, and just, so that's 1, that'd be 2, 3, 4, and just animate between each of the sections of the texture. That would be the easiest thing to do. But we do have some extra buttons that we can click that don't always do what we need to do unless I don't think it does that. I'm never sure why why that. This is the confusing thing about Blender and the way that it works, because you'd expect it to do certain things, but it doesn't because of the way that it handles data. But anyway, that's going off topic and possibly making it more confusing than it actually is. So that's why, getting back on topic, that's why we use parent, because the armature on its own, with an armature modifier assigned to the mesh, doesn't move when the armature is moved unless we're in pose mode. Whoops, wrong bone. So if you were doing something that required you to be moving your armature around, select your object and then parent it. But we're not going to do that just yet because we need to join all the meshes together, because otherwise we'll end up with two meshes when we import this into IMVU. We'd end up with an eyeball mesh and a pumpkin mesh. So just join those together, and let's just clear the armature. Clear that. Eyeball, pumpkin, object, join. So let's join the two together. Now we can assign the armature object. Armature, eyedropper, and again, mesh, armature, parent, object, and here's the pop-up. We want keep transform. So remember, or to reiterate, in order to get an accessory to work for IMVU, the mesh has to have an armature modifier. But whilst you're working on your project in Blender, you can parent the two objects together. So physically parenting objects. So now that we've got that, we've already got some vertex groups set up, which we did. And because we've joined the meshes now, we've got the two groups in place. And because we've made an association between the mesh and the armature, we should now find, if we select the armature and go into pose mode, if we select one of the bones, our meshes, or the sections of the mesh, move. And that's exactly what we want. So what we can do here, let's do a quick export test. Let's just save this, save as. Let's just do a quick test. Mesh, armature, file, export, FBX. So I want selected objects. Everything else is okay, that's all right. Geometry, that's all right. Armature, always disable add leaf bones. There is an animation with this, but we're not testing that right now, so let's just disable that for now. Bake animation. Pumpkin eye, test, export, FBX. So, IMVU Studio. Create. Accessories. Elvis glasses. Derive. Let's Let's just get rid of this cage, inventory. So, whoops. So if you don't know how Studio works with its inventory, click on the inventory tab and then you want this button that's got sliders on it. Click that. In use. And get rid of that. It should disappear. There we go. Right, so let's import our mesh. Import FBX. What do we call it? Pumpkin eye. Where is it? Oh, it's furniture. Uh, 2.8. Pumpkin eye. So it's going to give us a preview. That's what it's found. Set up FBX. Scale 0.01. So we need to make sure that we select the armature with the fewest number of bones, which is usually one less. There is a reason for that, but I can't remember why there's always two. But we always want, generally speaking, for standard accessories, the one with the fewest number of bones. And it'll generally start with attachment root rather than female 03. So set that. It's got our pumpkin. Next. It's got our materials. Next. Preview. So that's what it's going to bring in. Import. So there it is, and by default, as expected, it's attached to the avatar's head bone. So what we want to do is change that to attachment root. So component, skeleton. So we've got our skeleton there. And what we need to change now is the node, which is set to head. So we want that to be female 03 master root. And these are all the bones that each one of those armatures represents as an anchor point. So we want female 03 master root. Preview. And there is our accessory. Let's just play around with the material. Eyeball. Do we have a shiny? Add image. Let's just see what we've got that we can use for this. Let's just use the UV for the moment. That's quite interesting. So make that super shiny. So there's our shiny eyeball. So we'll sort that out later, but that's interesting. So that is our accessory imported into IMVU. No normal. In fact, could do. Let's try self-illuminate as well. Oh, right, of course. That disables Shininess. I don't know if it disables normal map as well. When you do self-illuminate, it disables the effects. So let's just save this. Save as. Awesome. And of course, if we wanted to change its position to another bone, we just select it from the drop down and the object will appear there. So in Blender, when you set up your object, the base armatures or the root armatures, those are not touched. You don't move those, don't reposition them or change their location or anything. If you need to do something where your mesh is offset, that's why we create our extra bones. We offset the extra bones, we don't touch the root, because that root is positioned and located where it is specifically to match the avatar bones. So pelvis node, female O3 master root, and I think is Z head on here. No, they've got rid of Z head. Z head, which is still in the accessory starter file, is up here, and that's where pets were traditionally positioned. But there's no real need for it because we have O3 master root. So what you would do if you wanted something up here or anywhere else, you position your mesh in Blender relative to female O3 master root. So before we parent, there's attachment, that's Z head. So if you wanted your pumpkin to be, it had a pair of wings and it was flying, we're actually using this as our anchor point. So what we would do is position the mesh up here, and then we would build the skeleton, these two bones, relative to this position at the top here. So what you don't want to be doing is moving female O3 master root, the root bones. Just keep those in place and swap, or not swap, create and position and edit the bones that you need in situ. So for a tail, for example, we would use pelvis, keep that where it is. So depending on the type of tail that you had, you might add a couple of extra bones, like so. And those would be in addition to pelvis. What's it called? Pelvis node. Yeah, pelvis node. Same with any of the other bones. So we don't change the position of these. So again, if we had an armature, not an armature, animated leggings, we would create an extra bone that maybe was like so, relative to this armature. So this doesn't change, but this does. Because that way, when you import, it matches. So what did we do? Was that left? That's left thigh. That's why if you just make an object and use any of the skeletons or any of the armatures, your objects will be positioned incorrectly. So you need to build everything in situ. So if we had done that, pumpkin would appear here because it was built relative to the root skeleton pointing out sideways. So don't change these, add to them. So we're creating extra bones. Right, I think we'll call it quits there. That's about an hour. So in the next one, what we'll do is go over animation. We'll animate the object, give it a simple animation. Actually, we've got a couple of minutes, so what we can do is play around with the textures a little bit now that we've got this in here. But in the next stream, what we'll do is animate and export the animation. What did it bring in? Did it bring any animation in? No. Yeah, so it'll be best to deal with that separately. So today was just about setting up, prepping our meshes. Whoops. As animated, well, we're prepping it for animation, but it's exactly the same for any other type of accessory. Today we've just been setting up and prepping our object for animation. Let's just save that again. Save as. Let's just do a quick bit of image editing for the eyeball. So let's just get the image in. Where is it? There it is. So that's our eyeball texture. So for the shininess, what we can do, so depending on how shiny we want this to be, let's just go with a flat. Let's try 175. Needs to be grayscale. Whoops. If you wanted to add, let's just add some noise to this just for the sake of filters, noise, add noise. Save as. Export. It's JPEG. Studio. Click on the little icon. Add image. Let's find our JPEG. There it is. So let's try and get this tilted towards the light. Preview. And there is our shiny eyeball. So depending on, so let's just do another layer. Make it a lighter color, 200. Add some noise again, just for export. Shininess 2. Add image. That's just slightly brighter. But we can see how that changes the reflectivity without necessarily having to actually edit that. So if we go all the way up to white, whoops, or let's, no, yeah, let's do up white, add some noise. Shininess 3. Studio. Let's bring that back up to halfway. So if we change that, add the white one in. So we can see how that changes the highlight. It makes our eyeball look shiny, but not necessarily wet. So you can play around with your shininess maps. To change the appearance of the eyeball or the shininess. Let's create one for the pumpkin. Pumpkin. Layout. Shininess. Export. So pumpkin material. Shininess. Preview. And there we can see the highlight added to the pumpkin. Obviously do a bit more editing to that. Ooh, it's made of gold. A golden pumpkin. Let's just save this file, save as. Right, so yeah, we'll call it quits there, and in the next one we shall go over creating some animations. So we're creating essentially an animated accessory. So basically a pet is an accessory that's just in the pet category of the catalogue. That's the only difference between a pet, a tail, animated tail, or an animated pair of earrings. So you do exactly the same thing with the pair of earrings, for example. So you would use not this armature, so let's hide that. That's for, I think that's another, it's been a while, but I think that's used as an attachment point for pets as well. But let's just hide that. What we want is the armature that's hidden inside the head. Where is it? That's the clavicle. X-tip. Where's the head bone gone? Oh, there it is. So, for a set of earrings, same principle as for the pumpkin. So we're in edit mode. We're duplicating the bones and we're creating an extra bone. What we want to do is position the bone relative to how we want the earring to animate. So let's say you had a drop earring. So if we just duplicate the bone and leave it as is, it'll be positioned relative to the original skeleton. So we'll create a new bone and it'll be orientated that way. So all we need to do is just rotate this round so that it's standing upright, and then in that position we just move it to where it needs to be. Again, as with the armature for the pet, once we've positioned the bone, so we position it relative to the head because that's the point around which the bone will rotate. So if the earring was to swing back and forth, we want the head to be positioned at the piercing so the bone can freely rotate around that axis. But once we've got that in position, we're then in, where is it? Bone properties. We're creating a parent relationship, parent-child relationship between the two bones. So that then gets linked to that. We'll get the same on the other side. And all you then do is just animate these two bones, so your earring bones, but not necessarily the root bones. So that's how you get your animated earrings set up. So that's the parent relationship, and that's all it is. So when you import this into IMVU, you are linking to the head bone. So your earrings should appear in place by default at the head. And it's the same for anything. So if it were a tail, same again as we discussed earlier, you're adding new bones to the original, creating a relationship between each of them, and then animating. So we'll do the animation, the actual animation, in the next stream. But for today, or for now, that is our pumpkin set up and ready for that next step, animating. Right, so we'll call it quits there. Thanks for lurking, lurkers. Thanks for dropping by, Soup, and we shall see you on the next video.